Hi, and welcome back. Our topic today is utilitarianism. So as we are trying to decide how to lead the best and most worthwhile life, we're going to take a different approach today and look to see which behaviors will provide the maximum amount of happiness for those involved. So this theory focuses on the principle of utility. The idea that we should always choose whatever action or social policy that's going to have the best consequences for everyone concerned. Now remember, this is about morals, it's about ethics, so we are trying to figure out what it is that we should do or what it is that we shouldn't do to lead the best and most worthwhile life. So with the principle of utility, we're looking to maximize the overall happiness of the most people concerned. And it's not that we're just permitted to do what is necessary to promote happiness, we're required to do what is necessary to provide the most happiness for those concerned. So there really are no hard and fast rules to utilitarianism. There's no list that we need to follow. There's nothing that is always right or always wrong, because in utilitarianism we are going to judge each act separately. So that's the idea here. Each act is judged right or wrong solely by the virtue of their consequence. So when we are assessing consequences, the only thing that's going to matter is the amount of happiness or unhappiness that's created. And when we're looking at the value of each person's happiness, that's going to count the same. So my happiness doesn't count more than Joe's happiness or than Johnny's happiness or than Betty Lou's happiness. Everyone's happiness counts the same. What is missing here are references to God and abstract rules. Remember, there's no rule book for utilitarianism. So what is a utilitarian view on non-humans? If this particular theory is taking a look at how do we make the most happy of those concerned, does that include animals? Or does it not include animals? And so if you take a utilitarian view on non-humans, it's not whether or not the individual has a soul or is rational, because sometimes people would say, well, it should only be humans because only humans are rational, only humans have a soul. To a utilitarian, it's not about that. It's about the ability or the capability of being able to experience happiness or unhappiness, pleasure or pain. So in the case of an animal, is the animal capable of experiencing happiness or unhappiness? If the individual, whether it's human or non-human, is capable of suffering, then a utilitarian would say that we have a duty to take into account that when we are deciding what we need to do, what is right and what is wrong, right? Even if the individual in question is not a human. Because both humans and non-humans can suffer, we have the same reason for not mistreating both. And to take them into consideration when we're determining creating maximum overall happiness. Now, that doesn't mean that we are never going to do anything that might cause an animal suffering. You know, lots of times people will say, well, does that mean that we should never do experiments with animals? And quite frankly, if you look back in history, many experiments that have been done with animals have led to many great scientific advancements. A utilitarian would say, no, it's not necessarily that. It doesn't mean that we're never going to do experiments with animals. They would say that if harm is to be done, there just needs to be greater justification, right? There needs to be greater good that's done for all concerned. So when we're looking at consequences, is there maximum happiness of all people concerned, or all individuals concerned, whether those be animals or humans? And if the most people are going to gain, we might still be doing certain kinds of experiences, at least from a utilitarian point of view. Okay, so utilitarianism is a fairly easy concept, right? We're going to choose whatever action has the maximum happiness for those concerned. Everyone's happiness counts the same. So my happiness not greater than your happiness. And the only thing that we judge actions to be right or wrong based on is the consequences, right? But there might be some problems with that, right? What are some of the objections to utilitarianism? Some people would say, okay, is pleasure the only thing that matters? Is that what we should always be striving for? A utilitarian would say that the right actions are the ones that produce the most good. But what is good? Is happiness good? And for classical utilitarians, original utilitarians, happiness is pleasure. But a lot of people equate that pleasure with hedonism, right? Instant gratification, ultimate good, ultimate happiness, right here, right now. That's really not what this is about. A utilitarian would say that hedonism really misunderstands the nature of happiness. It's not something that we recognize as good and seek for its own sake, but instead, happiness is a response that we have to the attainment of things that we recognize as good. It's a sort of a byproduct of those things that we see or that we recognize as good. Another objection to utilitarianism is the idea about consequences being the only thing that matters. Right? If we are to judge actions good or evil based solely on their consequences, is that the right thing to do? Are consequences the only thing that matter? Right? Let me give you some examples. If you take a look at the notion of justice, utilitarianism is incompatible with justice because justice requires that we treat people fairly according to the merits of the particular situation. And in utilitarianism, that might not be the case. If you had a situation where you had a supposed, rapist, let's say. He hasn't been tried, he hasn't been convicted, but the whole town believes that this guy was a rapist and that he should be put to death. A utilitarian would say put him to death because it would create the most happiness for those concerned. However, it seems a little bit incompatible with that man's notion of due process and justice, right? He wasn't convicted fairly. He wasn't tried fairly. None of that happened. It was just the will of the people wanting him to die. So justice sort of goes out the wheel or out the window, as do human rights. They sort of get trampled on many times. Utilitarianism also has problems with what we call backward-looking reasons, right? So it always looks to the future and the consequences in the future. It never takes the past into consideration. So let's say that I have my friend Johnny, and I tell Johnny that we're going to go out for pizza. And I make that plan with Johnny and say, okay, tomorrow night, Johnny, we're going to go out for pizza. And then tomorrow comes, and two of my other friends, Nikki and Jody, say, oh, Suzanne, let's go to the mall. Well, a utilitarian would look at the consequences of my actions, either going to the mall with Nikki and Jody or going for pizza with John, and which one of those activities is going to create the most overall happiness? Well, going to the mall with Nikki and Jody, because now we're talking about three people being happy versus maybe John just being unhappy. So we would do whatever has the most maximum happiness for the most people involved. But does that seem like a problem to you? It seems like a problem to me. I mean, what about that promise that I made to John? Don't I have a duty to uphold that promise? Utilitarianism doesn't address that. And so that can be seen as a real problem. Right? The other idea is that we should be concerned with everybody's happiness, right? But should we be equally concerned for all, right? John Stuart Mill said that we should be impartial, disinterested, benevolent spectators, right? But the problem with that is that we aren't impartial. We aren't disinterested. There are certain people in our life that we may have more concern for. We don't treat everybody in our life equally, right? If I'm looking at my kid's interests versus a stranger's interests, I'm going to pick my kid's interests every single time, right? But a utilitarian doesn't allow for that. They would say everybody's happiness counts the same. So this is going to sort of disrupt our personal relationships. I may not want my kid's happiness, my husband's happiness to count the same as a stranger that I don't even know. To me, they might count more, but utilitarianism doesn't account for that. Right? Some people would also say that utilitarianism is too demanding. I mean, if you were a faithful utilitarian, right, and we want to create the most happiness for those involved, what that would mean is that you would constantly be giving away your resources to make the most people happy, even if it made yourself unhappy, because that's what you need to do to create the maximum amount of happiness. But what you'd actually be doing is you'd constantly be giving away your resources to the point of lowering your own standard of living to the level of the neediest people you could help. If you had more to give, then a utilitarian would say you need to give that because you can help more people. More people are going to be happy if you give them your resources. But that is a sort of a revolving door. You keep giving your resources and keep giving your resources until it reduces you to being the neediest, at least to the level of the neediest people that you could theoretically help. Now, we might admire people who give and give and give and give, but I think a lot of us wouldn't necessarily see this as our duty. And so utilitarianism might fall flat there. Now, that doesn't mean that utilitarianism can just be thrown out the window completely. There are good points to it, right? Some people really like the idea of equality, right? This notion that people are treated equally, that you don't treat people differently because they are different people, right? And one of the arguments of utilitarianism is the idea that it leads to justification for doing bad acts. Right? And bad acts have bad consequences. But that might not necessarily be true. Not all acts have bad consequences. In fact, some bad acts, or what we might consider negative actions, might have good consequences. Now, utilitarians looked at some of these arguments and they said, okay, well, how can we adjust this theory, revise this theory to make it better? Right? And so one of the ways to do that was to change the principle of utility to being a guide for choosing rules, not acts. So classical utilitarianism requires that we judge each act on its individual merit, right, and the consequences of that act. So it's not that we judge lying in a particular situation. Everything is individual. What happens if we make rules based on the concept of maximizing happiness, right? We can alter this a little bit so that instead of looking at each individual action, we ask what set of rules is optimal in order to maximize happiness for most people involved, right? And so then we look at individual acts and assess whether or not we should do them or not do them according to whether or not they abide by the rules that have already been put in place. So, this is a really easy argument to those anti-utilitarian arguments that say, may lead people to do bad acts, right? It says, okay, well, we design rules that are more in line with our intuition of what we should be doing as humans, and then judge each individual act based upon those rules. So it's not about then, okay, well, what do you do? How can you say that lying or cheating or any of those kinds of things is a good thing to do? We sort of get away from that, right? Of course, there's always a flip side to that too. So if you have rules that you've set in place to maximize happiness for everyone involved, are there ever exceptions to the rule? Right? If you have a rule that says lying is bad, is there ever an exception to that rule? Is there ever a time when it would be okay to lie? And if you say yes, that becomes an exception to the rule. Right? But that's a slippery slope, because if you start making exceptions to the rule, then you sort of get yourself back to that act utilitarianism where you're judging individual acts, again, on their own merit. Right? If there are exceptions, you're really just judging individual acts. So it's sort of this conundrum that we find ourselves in. Right? Another critique of utilitarianism is that it can't make sense of some of our common values, right?